Just being able to say, hey, this is a long haul game here. That leaving on the field might be great for the Rose Bowl. It's not a great image to try to live your whole life by. In spurts, okay, but not the whole thing. And just to say, yeah, okay, so that's who I am. I'm limited like that, and that's okay. I think, once again, that's a huge part of self-care and self-acceptance, self-knowledge and self-acceptance.
When life throws a challenge at you, one thing is certain. To find a resolution for every issue, every problem, for everybody, there's more than one way. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the More Than One Way podcast. We're excited to share our latest episode with you. We're joined by special guest Brian Cole, Bishop of the Diocese of East Tennessee, for a discussion about work, self-care, competition, contemplation, and meaning. We look through the lens of the holiday season, busyness, metaphors for work, and methods for how we care for ourselves. Is there room to step away from drinking from the fire hose to drink from living water? We're so glad Brian could join us to share his perspective and experience. Let's jump into the conversation.
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about lately, since we're right here in the midst of the holidays, is how much work the holidays are,
Yeah.
and how much work people put into them. And I spend a great deal of time just trying to help people with that stress, just trying to help people with how much they're doing and how much they feel that they have to do and how much that they have to get done. So I was thinking about that, and my friend Brian, who works in the church like we do, sent me this article that was written and published by the Living Church, and I thought it was really one of the most helpful things that I've read, and I've passed it on to other people, especially for this time of year. And so Brian's here with us because we're going to try to talk about how, in the midst of all this chaos and work that we do, how do we kind of care for ourselves? How do we bring in the spiritual gift of self-care? So Brian, thanks for coming.
Yeah, we're glad to have you.
Yeah, Thom, thank you. Whitney, thank you. Yeah, I think this season, incarnation is about God becoming human, but somehow, like you're saying, we take it and say, let's try to become superhuman, right? How much can we accomplish? How much can we give? How much can we get done? I know a lot of people have all these family rituals that become burdens as opposed to life-giving, right? We have to do these things.
Right.
And to me, it's just one of those things we realize it's a setup, right? To think, is this season really to help us slow down, help us embrace humanity, which finitude and limits, as opposed to how much I can get done. Like even driving here, I live in West Hills. It's like I thought, okay, I need to avoid the mall traffic, right? Because like they're all out there today, just needing to get stuff done to the point that it impacts your ability to travel. There's some people thinking they got to get stuff done today.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things about your article that just struck me so much, and it's remind me exactly the title.
I think it's like from fire hose, from drinking from a fire hose to drinking from living water.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay, so drinking from a hot fire hose and drinking from living water. And I think that's what we're bringing up for this time of year. But what was so intriguing about the article to me, and Whitney, remember I passed it on to you, was that goes for all of life, the whole of life.
Right.
It gets magnified, like you said, at this time of year. But what caught me so much was, this is part of what we're trying to go through in the whole work life, self-care world that has become, at least within the last 10 years, a part of our lives. Work-life balance and that whole thing. And I just thought the images of fire hose and living water were just two beautiful images. So how did you come up with that?
Yeah, so I serve as the bishop here in East Tennessee, and I think I'd heard it too as a parish priest, but really heard it a lot in becoming a bishop, that I was going to be drinking from a fire hose. And as soon as I heard that, I thought, that sounds awful, right?
Yeah.
But then I saw bishops and clergy and nonprofit leaders who would talk about in their work life that they were drinking from a fire hose. And I remember thinking, surely there's no other images of torture we would hold up as like how to approach your work life.
Yeah.
You wouldn't say, I'm being assaulted all day long. Like you would say that's out of bounds, right? But yet, but the way in which it's spoken of and valorized, there's a thing called College for Bishops, and I go there and they're like, you're going to be drinking from a fire hose. And again, I'm like, this is awful.
Yeah.
And and I'm just thinking, I'm never going to say to someone, that's how you should approach work. And for me, what was helpful was able to think, is there another way to frame work, right? And to think about Jesus with the woman at the well and saying there's this living water, and if you drink the living water, you won't be thirsty again. And I thought that, for me, that was it. That was like the whole idea of the spiritual life or the good life surely should be something around an abundance that also leads towards this is enough, right? As opposed to I have to have more. And I think what's interesting even now as people talk about self-care, if we're not careful, the temptation is to be the very best person at self-care, right? Which becomes its own kind of temptation, as opposed to a part of the care is finite and limits. And I noticed it too during COVID that bishops travel a lot. So all of a sudden, bishops were talking about how much they were Zooming, again, as if it was like a contest, right? And you couldn't say, "Well, I didn't Zoom today." Like, what do you mean you didn't Zoom today? Do you matter? And so I think, especially in the Christian life, and just being human, the idea of like there's just enough of me, as opposed to I have to prove something, or I have to approach work. It's really ultimately humiliating, right? And I thought, and so kind of my goal is to, can we just kind of rid ourselves of that sort of language when it comes to work?
Yeah, it's a great goal. And it made me, I started asking Whitney and people who worked within the non-church world at times, what that image felt like for him.
Yeah, I worked for a technology company for a while that was very leading edge, and so there was a lot of pressure to stay on that cusp of knowledge and information. It felt like to the second, with the idea that if something was out or if something was announced, you needed to be an expert on it at that minute to be able to communicate it to other people. And it was exciting initially with the idea of, hey, we're close to the edge, this is fun, we're right when we're the first to know. And then it quickly became just unwieldy, with this idea of this pressure that I felt like that even in my off time, all my off time needed to be studying, so that when I was there, I could be the source of information that people expected. But there was no possible way to get in front of it. Right. There was no way. It was always changing, which was exciting, but it left you feeling like I'm always behind and I'm always not where I want to be. And it got to the point where someone else approached me and told me, you're miserable. and I was defensive initially. I was like, what are you talking about? But then the more I started thinking about that, I'm like, gosh, they're right. I had no existence outside of that chase for that information because of the thrill I initially felt. And then I was like, you have nothing else. And it was really defeating to the point of having to really rethink things, to the point of finding a much healthier path. But being caught up in it, and in the midst of it, you're talking about the image of drinking from a fire hose. It's interesting how common that metaphor is. It's not like somebody said that and be like, and what I mean by that is everybody knows that. I mean, it's become part of what work is, or how it's defined in our society. So,
how do you guys think that happened? How did that become the dominant? And like you said, it was just well accepted in your world. It was well accepted in your world. It's certainly well accepted in my world. Why do you think that's become such the dominant way to be normal? Let's just use that word.
So when I was in college, I went to college thinking I was going to be a certified public accountant.
Ooh, nice.
And that's when the book In Search of Excellence had just come out. That was like the big business book. And I think it was Thom Peters.
Yeah.
He was looking at these excellent organizations, right? And it was kind of what you were talking about, Whitney, of like they were ahead of everybody else. And if you could be excellent, right? If you were excellent, then all of a sudden, stock value and retire at 30, and it was all held up as like you have to be excellent, right? Which meant you had to defeat somebody, right? And so work is competition as opposed to does work give meaning?
Yeah.
So for me, I think as a college student who then became a seminarian, who then became a church worker and then a priest, I think that idea of excellence was important and kind of took hold in me, right? And then I think as a parish priest, I know for me as a parish priest in the Episcopal Church, I remember thinking, okay, well, maybe everybody else's church is declining, but not mine, right?
Yeah.
And if I work hard enough, then we're going to buck that trend. And I think for a long time, and the entire time as a parish priest, I thought, if I work hard enough, my church is going to grow, right? And so again, it's a temptation that you have to be ahead of the game. So at least for me, it was in the 80s in sort of business work culture that it was competition, which is funny because again in the 20th century at some point it's all about what was the thing, labor saving devices, right?
Oh yeah.
So we have these labor saving devices, but we just found more work to do as opposed to like we saved all this time and now there's less to do. And there's more space to fill.
So in a sense the whole business climate that then we kind of all have to live in becomes dominated by this sense of competition and excellence and production and that becomes the norm, right? And you know what that makes me think of? Emily in Paris, of all things. Emily in Paris.
You never would have guessed that.
I know. If I had given you a million guesses, would you have guessed that? No. So Emily in Paris. A friend of ours, right, was telling us about watching Emily in Paris, and we were talking about some of this, and then how do you care for yourself in this kind of climate? And she said, well, Emily in Paris, one of the first scenes, Emily, the main character, was a kind of a go-getter, workaholic, type A person, fit right into this culture that you're talking about. Works really well for her. And she worked and did really well, and I suppose, in a sense, got a promotion and was moved to Paris. And she started working in Paris, but what she noticed as she was working was that people were leaving all throughout the day. And it was she couldn't figure it out. It was freaking her out a bit. So she went to somebody and said, what is going on? People are just leaving whenever. And the person that she was talking to said, well, they got their work done today. And she said, what do you mean they got their work done today? Give them more, right? Right. Give them more work. And the whole culture over there, now whether this is true, I think it's true, is sure you have to work and sure you want to do a good job, but once you're done and you can go. And this is one of Emily's big growing edges is can she now function in a culture that's like that as opposed to one that she got used to. And it just made me think, how do we, if we have any sense of this kind of self-care or any sense of, if you want to use the Judeo-Christian spiritual tradition, the Sabbath, how do we begin to take our own self-care and our own needs, or to use your metaphor, drink the living water in the midst of a culture that really might not support us all that much in that? So what do you think about that? How do you guys see that?
Well, the writer Flannery O'Connor talked about, that you will know the truth and the truth will make you odd. So I do think a part of a church person, a person of spirit, is to be a countercultural posture, right? To kind of, there's another way. And it doesn't mean you don't become a Puritan, you don't, walk around, finger wagging, but it's just to say, I'm going to live differently. And And so I think again, and I think a part of, I can say as a church person in the 21st century, I think also the Firehose image is tempting because I think we are wondering and worried about, like, do we matter?
Mm-hmm.
Does the church matter?
Yeah.
So if I'm working really hard, then I must matter, we must matter, as opposed to maybe if what we're actually witnessing or embodying is a kind of wholeness that allows me to matter for a lifetime, not just for a great couple-year run and then you're burned out.
Yeah.
So I think it takes other people to kind of join you, right? I think if you're doing it by yourself, then you look like a slacker, right?
Yeah.
But if you were to say, like, let's have circles of support like that, and I think it's what the early church did in all kinds of ways. You know, we're going to share things. We're going to make sure everyone's fed. So we're not going to compete as much as we're going to be compassionate. We're going to share.
So cultivating that kind of a life and a life with that. What do you think, Whitney? What?
You know, it's interesting. You brought up the topic of Sabbath, and I was listening to a podcast with Rainn Wilson the other day, and he was interviewing a rabbi, and they got on the topic of Sabbath, and she was saying, you know, in our culture, it's easy to think of it kind of the idea of everybody's working for the weekend, kind of with the idea that you race through the week, and then the Sabbath is the chance to catch your breath. And she's like, that's not at all the understanding. The understanding is that that's the place that energy and source come out of for you to approach the week, not the race and then the deep breath at the finish line. You know, and so that was very helpful for me in a different way to really think about and frame that with the idea that time, whenever you find it, is really, it's not the escape as much as it's a reconnection to the source for just a recalibration of sorts to the idea of, no, this is life.
Yeah.
This is a path forward versus just a race and a rest, a race and a rest, a race and a rest.
And to use the metaphor, Jesus' metaphor that you pick up on, that's living water for that,
right,
for the people who can live that. Because one of the things about self-care for me that I think is so central is self-care, one big component is self-knowledge, is really, really getting to know yourself. Because I think on some level, each of us is going to experience what you guys are talking about in our own way, in our own unique way. And hopefully we're not doing it in isolation. Hopefully we're doing it within the context of people who can support us. But it's still going to be an individual experience. It's still going to be and so the more I can know myself, then the better I can care for myself in the sense, a great sense of that, especially in the midst of an environment that might not be willing to help as much as something like a really strong spiritual community, Christian community. You know what I mean? You know what I'm getting at? I'm getting at the idea that the more I can know me, the more I'll know what will feed me, the more I'll know what that living water will be for me and will help me. And I think that that's true for each of us in our own way. And we can support each other by knowing ourselves like that. I think that's a huge thing.
We were talking earlier about Thomas Merton and Gethsemane Abbey, and Merton in New Seeds of Contemplation talks about that the contemplative goes into the desert not to avoid people, but to know how to be with them. And as a kid, growing up in the Baptist church, we had this preacher who would often say, we're called to love people and use things, not use people and love things. And I think for me, when I feel frantic and not centered and not grounded, is when I'm more likely to use people, right? And maybe use them for good things, but you're ultimately using people as opposed to, am I really treating you like a child of God, like someone worthy of respect, or do I need something out of you because I'm working at this frantic pace? And, you know, Merton at the beginning of New Seeds of Contemplation, so he writes that book in 1961, and in the preface he talks about his primary audience are folks without religious affiliation, which to me is like, was that like 12 people in 1961? And yet you realize, I think it's why we still read him, is because he was speaking to like everybody and not just the churchy folk, right? and realizing everyone deserves
Yeah.
living water,
Yeah.
right? Everyone deserves to be a whole human and not just,
Like a
work
function.
product.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, once again, this idea that if I deepen into myself, I'll find the pathways and the places that can help me with not just self-care, but find that living water. And I'll give you a for instance. So whenever we talk about self-care with some people, that they think of things like, well, going to get a facial or going to get a massage, and all that stuff is fine, is what I would say to me, because your body's part of the whole deal. But the more I can know myself, you see, I wouldn't stop with the massage and think the massage has just fixed me. It would be, no, the massage is going to point out where I'm sore, where I'm in pain, and then I can have a sense of how did that happen.
Yeah. Okay.
Or sure, it's lactic acid buildup or whatever else it is. But what's going on with that?
That's
and from a
that.
spiritual perspective, with the mind, body, spirit connection, it's all one anyway. So to me, those kind of things are your body saying to you, hey, pay attention. Something's going on. So I know for me, when I go to get a massage, it's usually all around my neck and shoulders and back. Right? Interesting that it's all that. And as a parish priest, there's times what I recognize is I try to carry more than I need to carry. That I think somehow or another it's my job to carry the burdens of anybody that I come in contact with. And my body says that's at least one piece. There's other pieces, I'm sure. But that's one piece that I got very aware of through massage. And that is, hey, help people with their burdens. Don't take them on. And that's what I mean. That's a deeper part of self-care then, is paying attention to myself and saying, okay, I have a tendency to do this. Start watching this. And this will help me more with this whole idea of self-care. Because even taking on somebody's burden, something as good as that, can be a fire hose situation, right?
Yeah.
Because lots of burdens out there.
Well, and two, you said earlier about this season, if this season is about God abiding with us, that also sort of suggests there's a long haul approach. Right? So if you get ordained, you're like, I'm going to take on everyone's burdens. You're going to do that for 3 years, and then you're going to be done.
Yeah, it's just
right?
dead.
And whatever happened to Thom Rasnick,
Yeah,
right?
that's right.
But if you understand...
Such a promising young guy.
Yeah, you're going to miss that guy.
Yeah.
And but if you realize, okay, this is about a lifetime...
Yeah.
that hopefully at the end of your life there's more of you, right? As opposed to like you just get across the finish line and you're in fumes, right? And again, I think
broken down.
we set ourselves up to think, leave it all on the field in a way that's like sacrifice and almost destroying yourself, as opposed to there's more of you at the end, right? Which does require discernment around what you can and can't take on.
Yeah. That's a great example of what I mean by getting to know yourself. That self-care it is self-acceptance, self-knowledge that then hopefully leads to self-acceptance. And then all that, just being able to say, hey, this is a long-haul game here. Yeah. That leaving on the field might be great for the Rose Bowl.
Right.
But it isn't great for life.
It's that competition piece coming back in, with the idea of
it's not a great image to try to live your whole life by. Yeah. In spurts, okay, but not the whole thing. And just to say, okay, so that's who I am. I'm limited like that, and that's okay. I think that's a huge part of self-care and self-acceptance. Self-knowledge and self-acceptance.
Well, it's also some discernment too. You mentioned earlier about other work environments, Whitney. Remember the first time I saw a priest with a copy of Fast Company, that magazine? It's like, I'm gonna figure out all the business hacks and get ahead of the game. Again, I think it requires persons of faith and faith communities to have discernment around. So yes, on the one hand, we're nonprofits, and we need to have good practices, and we can learn from other communities. At the same time, our product is just helping people find themselves, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to using people.
Right.
And so I think if we understand the product, the intent is like more humanity, like more of the person as opposed to you're a consumer, right? I think to realize, they're not consumers. We're inviting them to consume living water, bread from which they'll never hunger again. So the consumption is the Eucharist to say there's enough, you're all welcome, we'll make sure you all get fed, as opposed to the competition of there might not be enough, so you need to compete, you need to be ahead of the game or you're behind. And I think, again, we could talk about this a long time. This is where we realize in the church we have no way to critique capitalism, right? That's that's the water we swim in.
Yeah, right.
And so they set the rules, and it's really hard for us to talk about a different economy.
Well, one of the things in your article that struck me that I think fits in with some of this different economy is contemplative practices that you talked about that. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. If it's all right, I'll start by saying that this goes back to the spa day. Like, I love massage, I love spa day. I think for a long time I used to think a contemplative practice was for people who had enough time. And I've just written a piece around becoming an accidental contemplative. When I was a teenager and I worked with my dad. My dad was the church janitor at the church we attended, and so I was the assistant church janitor. And the experience of cleaning this Baptist church, which was very much given to fundamentalism, but being in the space by myself, I now realize was my first experience of contemplation. Washing a window, mopping a floor, buffing a floor, realizing now it's like, wow, I had a sense of God was with me. And so, and not grasping, not achieving, not competing. So for me, I think that the contemplative life is what we're all called to do and all invited to do. So it's not only for monks, only for nuns, only for people with time or, money to spare, but it's really for everyone. And so for me, in the Christian life, the invitation to say, it comes from the season, if God is with us, then God's not planning to not be with us. And so the invitation is to slow down enough to be aware of God's presence, which requires us to slow down. Also, I'll say one other thing before sharing this conversation. I think all the more that we need to get away from the Firehose image is because some people do really have to take on dehumanizing work, right? So we have to admit some people have jobs that really hurt them and harm them. So we can't somehow embrace the idea that the work is hurting us, right? Because for some people their work does hurt them. We want to invite them to other kinds of work in order to say everyone should have the space and time to know they're a child of God, to know they matter, to know they're human. And for me, I think it's the real thing the church is called to teach, but I don't think we have the courage to think that's the whole thing.
Yeah.
Right? It has to be more than that. 'Cause that seems like, how hard is that? And yet it takes your whole life, I think, to practice it.
Yes, it does. It really, really, really does. So in terms of the way I'm hearing you talk about contemplation is deep presence in whatever it is, wherever it is you happen to be and whatever it is you happen to be doing. That is also a kind of an openness to a larger presence. And I think sometimes people when they hear the word contemplation, think you're sitting in lotus position, and sure, that can be one way, but
or they think it's just because you're an introvert, right? And I think of myself very much as an extrovert, and yet to me the call to contemplation is essential just to be human and to really to understand the Christian life. Because again, I think Jesus, you see it in the Gospels, Jesus spends time away, says That's enough crowd time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Rises early to pray. I mean, he's aware that God is with him,
Mm-hmm.
and he wants that for us. And again, I think for the church, it requires us the courage to believe what seems like not enough is actually all that we have. Right? Is that call to awareness of God's presence?
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people walk around with a sense of God is not with them, or they have to go find God, right?
Yep.
And they might have to it might be some sort of transaction, right? So this fits the capitalist approach of like, if I do these things, then I will find God, as opposed to, what if I stop doing so many things? Might I be aware that God is with me?
Yeah, and then once again, the idea of just slowing down and stopping can really push up against the fire hose. Not just image, but the fire hose image as being, this is just the way it is. This is what's normal.
Yeah.
And so in that regard, then slowing down, stopping, and paying attention becomes massively countercultural. Right?
Yeah, for sure.
But and I can just speak for myself here, and everybody has to speak for themselves on this, is I find it extremely life-giving. And that's part of what I mean by self-knowledge is I am an introvert for sure, but I've tried to function as an extrovert because I thought that's what you were supposed to do.
Yeah.
Right? So I thought that this is what's presented to me, and it's presented to me not just as normal, but as the only healthy way to be. And that means, and then once again, if you add in production into it, the more you get done, the better you are, and all that kind of stuff. So I've functioned that way for quite a while, and then hit a wall, you know, and recognize. And it wasn't until, I was like 32, 33, when I first started going off to monasteries and things like that. And that's where I found my life-giving water was just that. Okay, in a monastery, I was forced to slow down.
Yeah.
And then I recognized, man, I like this.
Yeah.
I prefer this to the other. And my challenge then is to been able to, you still got to come and function in this society. And yes, it's going to feel a little bit weird, a little bit countercultural, but it brings me life anyway.
Yeah. Well, there's also a great quotation about contemplation from Walter Urquhart, I think is his name. He's a Jesuit preacher. Contemplation is a long, loving look at the real. And so the idea of it takes time to kind of just keep sitting with what's in front of you, right? And to look at it with love, not as a critic, not as a cynic, and to get a sense of what is really in front of me. Because again, I think the fire hose image suggests everything matters, everything's important, everything's urgent. And then you realize it really isn't, right? You do all these tasks that people then forget about, but you did it at a frantic pace. So I do think the sense of, if we in the church work thought our real task is to help people sit with what is real in front of them and help them look with time, look with love. Again, it doesn't mean we all become monks or all become, enlightened in a way, as much as just aware of what's around us.
Yeah.
And invite others into that, right? And to say, that's not competitive. There's more space for people. There's a limit, there's no limit to how many people who can practice that. And when people can't practice that, we can say, what's keeping that from happening in their life? Is there an issue of justice, or is it just a matter of distraction? But we can ask the question once we invite people to say, this isn't just for the monk. It's not just for the parish priest. We really want this for everybody.
Yeah.
And I think there's some real power when you're in a group or even just a friendship or a connection of people doing that together, with the idea that, maybe you're not reflecting on the same thing, but knowing that you're both reflecting and connecting to that real. Sometimes I've heard that through someone else. I've heard that through someone else's experience, and I'm like, oh yeah, that resonates. That's really cool. So thinking about going away to a monastery or some of the other images that we've talked about, finding ways to be in those contemplative practices together. I think there's something really intriguing about that too.
Yeah.
I think also a way to help people think about contemplative practice, again, is to take it out of the competition space. Because I think some people think, well, I'm doing it wrong, right?
Yeah.
And so it can be centering prayer. Yes, it can be contemplative silence, but it also might just be really mindful walking, right? Or mindful journaling, or a day that just belongs to you, where you simply do one thing, and just, I think, to give people as many possible ways that they can have a sense of, I am practicing contemplative postures.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, we become another kind of competitive thing, right?
This is the true way to do it.
Yeah.
I have a friend that's rewilding his property, and to hear him talk about that and the care that he puts into that, and why he's introducing certain trees and removing other trees, and for him, I mean, it is a practice. It's something, being in the midst of that land and having a vision for what that land could be, what it had become, and kind of that restoration. All of that for him is a way that he does that. It's fun to listen to the different things that he's finding and what he's doing. It's very contagious.
Have you seen, you mentioned Emily in Paris, which I've not seen.
But me either. Just
have y'all seen the film Perfect Days?
Is it the one about the janitor?
Yeah.
I have.
So Perfect Days.
Oh my goodness.
The director, is it Wim Wenders or Wim Wenders? He's German, right?
Mm-hmm.
You've not seen this?
No, I haven't.
Oh my gosh.
No, I'd love to hear you guys talk about it.
So it's one of my favorite films. I don't get that enough. And this guy's a janitor in Tokyo. And it's almost like if you saw the film Groundhog Day, but it was on purpose.
Yeah.
Because every day is kind of the same day. He wakes up, he sleeps on a mat, he brushes his teeth, he trims his mustache, he puts on his uniform, he goes outside, he buys some coffee from like a dispenser, he gets in this van, he plays like 1970s, 1980s Depeche Mode, I think. He has these cassettes, and he does the same day over and over again. And he cleans toilets. He cleans public toilets. But he is doing it like with an intention and a care and a devotion.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the day, he goes to kind of a little bar and drinks a beer and orders a meal and is watching some sporting event. He goes home, he reads his book, he falls asleep, and he just keeps doing that.
He does it again,
And there's this one part of the film where his niece, for reasons that I won't go into, is living with him. And so they're spending some time together. There's very little dialogue in this film. But at one point he says to her, now is now, next time is next time. And for me, what was great about the film was, okay, so very little happens in the film. There's no Firehose images, right? It's like real slow.
I can say it's kind of an inaction blockbuster.
That's right.
You think about like an action movie, it is no action.
Yeah.
But it's,
and yet, I mean,
the anecdote to action.
there's something about it.
Well, and I think also too, in that case, like, he has cleaned that toilet. That toilet is clean, right? And he lives in this life that he has been able. He has discovered his life, self-discovery, self-knowledge of, like, he drinks that coffee, he listens to that Depeche Mode, he drives that van. There's a joy in him, and it's and again, there's a part of the film where you realize there's some grief in him as well. But so he's not like super spiritual, but there's a joy in him that is present that I think many people would think, I want that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I want to get off the fire hose. I want to drink what that guy's drinking.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And Perfect Days, I cannot recommend it highly enough. So.
Well, yeah, there you go. Yeah, because one of the things that just made me think of is, the antidote to overstimulation, or the Firehose is not more.
Mm-hmm.
It's not more simulation. It's less.
Yeah.
And that somehow or another to find that sweet spot that just does it for you is the deal.
Well, I finally heard someone the other day say that when Jesus was talking to Martha and Mary, that he wasn't critiquing that Martha was doing too much, as much as what she was doing was distracting her from contemplation.
Yeah.
Where Mary is doing one thing,
Yeah.
but it's not that Martha's a busybody. It's that her approach to what she was doing distracted her.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could make the case of, if Martha could have approached work as each thing I'm doing in praise of the divine, then maybe she doesn't get, scolded slightly by Jesus.
Yeah.
As opposed
and then maybe she's not so worried about Mary, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mary's on your path.
Yeah.
Get on your path, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the More Than One Way podcast, brought to you by the Center for Spiritual Practice in Knoxville, Tennessee. We really appreciate your time and would love to hear your feedback. You can reach us by emailing hello@morethanonewaypod.com, or you can connect with us on social media using the handle @morethanonewaypod. If you found this episode helpful, we hope that you'll share it with your friends, with your family, with people you work with all the people who you know. Thank you and take care.